8 women who declared war on America from within, transforming from citizens into the most wanted domestic militants in U.S. history. These weren't foreign enemies who infiltrated our borders. These were students, lawyers, and mothers who used their American freedoms to bomb government buildings, kill law enforcement officers, and wage revolutionary warfare against their own country. Welcome to Savage Case Files. Today we're exposing America's most dangerous female militants who turned revolution into bloodshed on American soil. From Weather Underground leaders who bombed the U.S. Capitol and Pentagon to fugitives still on the FBI's most wanted list decades later, these 8 women brought domestic warfare to American streets through systematic violence and betrayal. Unlike foreign enemies who attack from outside our borders, these women grew up in America, attended American universities, and enjoyed American freedoms before choosing to destroy the very system that protected their rights. Their violent rebellion represents the ultimate betrayal of everything they once claimed to believe in: democracy, justice, and peaceful change. From Capitol bombings in the 1970s to international terrorism support in the 2000s, these cases span decades of domestic militant activity that challenged American security and exposed the potential for homegrown revolutionary violence. Each woman exploited her American identity and constitutional protections to wage war against the government and citizens she had sworn to respect. Their crimes brought revolutionary warfare to American soil, proving that the greatest threats to national security often come from those who walk among us as neighbors, professionals, and community members, while secretly planning destruction and death. Hit subscribe to never miss our investigations into the most dangerous revolutionaries who waged war against their own country, transforming American freedoms into weapons of domestic terrorism and revolutionary violence. Case 1. Bernardine Dohrn. Bernardine Dohrn was a brilliant University of Chicago Law School graduate who seemed destined for a successful legal career, but the turbulent 1960s transformed her from promising student into the most wanted female revolutionary in American history. Her intelligence, charisma, and radical ideology made her the perfect leader for the Weather Underground, the domestic terrorist organization that would bring warfare to American soil. Born in 1942 to a middle-class family, Dohrn excelled academically and showed early promise as a civil rights advocate during her law school years. Her involvement in student activism and anti-war protests gradually radicalized her worldview, leading her to conclude that peaceful change was impossible and violent revolution was necessary to transform American society. By 1969, Dohrn had become the primary leader and spokesperson for the Weather Underground, a militant offshoot of Students for a Democratic Society that advocated for the violent overthrow of the American government. Her famous declaration that the group was bringing the war home became the rallying cry for domestic terrorism campaigns across the United States. Under Dohrn's leadership, the Weather Underground launched a systematic bombing campaign targeting symbols of American military and government power. The group's most audacious attacks included bombing the U.S. Capitol building in 1971, the Pentagon in 1972, and numerous police facilities across the country. Each attack was designed to demonstrate the vulnerability of American institutions and inspire further revolutionary violence. Dohrn personally planned and coordinated these bombing campaigns, using her legal training to help the group avoid detection while maximizing the psychological impact of their attacks. Her ability to articulate the group's revolutionary ideology made her the public face of domestic terrorism during the height of 1960s radicalism. The FBI launched one of the largest domestic manhunts in American history to capture Dohrn and her Weather Underground associates. She was placed on the FBI's most wanted list and became the subject of intensive surveillance operations designed to penetrate the underground networks supporting domestic terrorists. But her ability to evade capture would make her a legend among revolutionaries and an embarrassment to federal law enforcement agencies. For over a decade, Dorn lived underground using false identities, safe houses, and a network of radical supporters who helped her avoid detection while continuing to coordinate terrorist activities. During her fugitive years, Dorn continued to issue statements and manifestos calling for violent revolution against the American government. Her writings celebrated attacks against police officers and encouraged other radicals to escalate their violent activities against government targets and law enforcement personnel. The Weather Underground's bombing campaigns under Dorn's leadership caused millions of dollars in property damage and created a climate of fear among government officials and law enforcement agencies. Her group's ability to strike high-profile targets demonstrated the vulnerability of American institutions to domestic terrorist attacks. In 1980, Dorn made the shocking decision to voluntarily surrender to federal authorities after more than a decade as a fugitive. Her surrender came after federal prosecutors had been forced to drop many of the most serious charges against her due to illegal FBI surveillance activities that violated her constitutional rights. Despite her role in orchestrating multiple bombings of federal buildings and advocating for violent revolution, Dorn received only probation and avoided any significant prison time. Her lenient sentence sparked controversy and outrage among law enforcement officials who had spent years hunting her. Following her surrender, Dorn reinvented herself as a law professor and children's rights advocate, eventually joining the faculty at Northwestern University Law School. Her transition from domestic terrorist to respected academic became one of the most controversial career transformations in American history. Today, Dorn remains a polarizing figure who avoided accountability for her role in domestic terrorism while building a successful academic career. Her case demonstrates how radical ideology and legal technicalities could allow domestic terrorists to escape justice and achieve respectability despite their violent past. The legacy of Bernardine Dorn's Weather Underground leadership continues to influence discussions about domestic terrorism, radical activism, and the appropriate response to violent revolutionary movements that emerge from within American society. Case 2. Kathy Boudin. Kathy Boudin was born into privilege and radical politics as the daughter of Leonard Boudin, a famous civil rights attorney who represented controversial clients including Fidel Castro and Paul Robeson. Her upbringing in Manhattan's intellectual elite seemed to guarantee a life of comfortable activism, but her involvement with the Weather Underground would lead her down a path toward armed robbery and murder. Educated at Bryn Mawr College, Boudin became involved in anti-war protests and radical politics during the late 1960s. Her privileged background and family connections provided her with resources and credibility within radical circles, making her a valuable recruit for the Weather Underground's violent revolutionary activities. By the mid-1970s, Boudin had become deeply involved in the underground network of radical organizations that supported armed revolution against the American government. Her white appearance and educated background made her an ideal operative for activities that required avoiding suspicion from law enforcement agencies focused on tracking known radicals. The Weather Underground's bombing campaigns of the early 1970s had largely ended by the late decade, but many former members like Boudin remained committed to revolutionary violence. They began collaborating with the Black Liberation Army and other militant groups to carry out armed robberies designed to fund continued terrorist activities. On October 20, 1981, Boudin participated in one of the most notorious armed robberies in American history when she joined a team that attacked a Brinks armored car in Nyack, New York. The robbery was planned to steal $1,600,000 that would fund revolutionary activities by multiple radical organizations working together. Boudin's role in the robbery involved using her white appearance to avoid suspicion as the getaway driver for the Black Liberation Army gunmen who would carry out the actual attack. Her presence was designed to make the escape vehicle appear less threatening to law enforcement officers who might encounter them. The robbery quickly turned deadly when the gunmen opened fire on the Brinks guards, killing security guard Peter Page instantly. The robbers successfully stole the money and attempted to escape in vehicles driven by Boudin and other Weather Underground associates who were waiting nearby. During the escape attempt, police officers Edward O'Grady and Waverly Brown attempted to stop what appeared to be a routine traffic violation. The robbers immediately opened fire, killing both officers in a hail of automatic weapons fire that demonstrated their willingness to murder anyone who interfered with their escape. Her privileged background couldn't protect her from the consequences of murder when police captured her at the roadblock following the deadly shootout. Despite her attempts to claim innocence, overwhelming evidence linked her directly to the planning and execution of the robbery that had claimed 3 lives. The investigation revealed that Boudin had been actively involved in planning the robbery for months, participating in surveillance of the target and coordination with the Black Liberation Army gunmen who carried out the attack. Her fingerprints were found on materials used in the robbery planning. During her trial, Boudin attempted to portray herself as a minor participant who had been manipulated by more radical associates. However, prosecutors demonstrated that her involvement was extensive and that she had willingly participated in an operation she knew would likely result in violence and death. Boudin was convicted of felony murder for her role in the deaths of the 3 victims, even though she had not personally fired the shots that killed them. Under New York law, all participants in a felony that results in death can be held responsible for murder, regardless of their specific actions. She was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison, a term that reflected the seriousness of her crimes and the impact on the families of the 3 men who had been murdered during the robbery. Her sentence marked the end of her revolutionary activities and the beginning of a long period of incarceration. During her 22 years in prison, Boudin became a model prisoner who earned a master's degree and worked with other inmates on educational programs. Her transformation behind bars became part of her eventual argument for parole consideration. In 2003, Boudin was granted parole and released from prison, having served her minimum sentence. Her release sparked controversy among law enforcement officials and victims' families, who believed she should have remained imprisoned for life. Following her release, Boudin became an academic and social justice advocate, working with organizations focused on criminal justice reform and prisoner rights. Her transformation from terrorist to respected advocate sparked ongoing debates about redemption and accountability for violent crimes. Case 3. Sarah Jane Olson. Sarah Jane Olson was born Kathleen Celaya in 1947, growing up in a middle-class family before becoming radicalized during her college years at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Her transformation from ordinary student to member of the notorious Symbionese Liberation Army would lead to one of the longest and most successful fugitive cases in American criminal history. The Symbionese Liberation Army burst into national consciousness in 1974 with the kidnapping of newspaper heiress Patty Hearst, an event that shocked America and introduced the public to a new form of domestic terrorism. Zolia joined the SLA during the height of their criminal activities, participating in bank robberies and bomb plots that terrorized California communities. Following the kidnapping, the SLA forced Hearst to participate in their criminal activities, including bank robberies that were filmed and broadcast nationwide. Celaya became part of the inner circle that controlled Hearst and planned the group's escalating criminal campaign against government and corporate targets. The SLA's most ambitious plots involved bombing police stations and government facilities across California using sophisticated explosive devices designed to kill law enforcement officers. Celaya participated in the planning and preparation of these bombing attempts, which were intended to demonstrate the group's ability to strike at symbols of government authority. On August 21, 1975, Celaya and other SLA members planted pipe bombs under police cars in Los Angeles, intending to kill officers when they started their vehicles. The bombs failed to detonate properly, preventing what could have been multiple police murders, but the attempt demonstrated the group's willingness to target law enforcement for assassination. The FBI launched a massive investigation into the SLA's activities, using informants, surveillance, and forensic evidence to identify and track the group's members. Solaya was indicted for her role in the bombing plots and became a federal fugitive when she disappeared before her arrest. She would disappear completely, living a double life that fooled everyone around her for over 2 decades. In 1976, Solaya assumed the identity of Sarah Jane Olson and moved to Minnesota, where she created an entirely new life as a suburban housewife and community volunteer. As Sarah Jane Olson, she married a doctor, raised 3 daughters, and became deeply involved in community activities including theater groups, school boards, and charitable organizations. Her neighbors and friends knew her as a dedicated mother and civic-minded citizen who contributed positively to their community. For over 20 years, Olson successfully maintained her false identity while the FBI continued searching for Kathleen Solaya. She avoided detection by staying away from radical politics and creating a completely conventional lifestyle that provided perfect cover for her fugitive status. Her carefully constructed new life began to unravel in 1999 when the television program America's Most Wanted featured her case and broadcast photographs comparing Kathleen Solaya to Sarah Jane Olson. Alert viewers noticed the resemblance and contacted authorities with tips about her location. The FBI investigation confirmed that Sarah Jane Olson was indeed the fugitive Kathleen Solaya, leading to her arrest at her Minnesota home in June 1999. Her arrest shocked neighbors and friends who had known her for decades, without suspecting her terrorist past. During her arrest, Olson initially denied her true identity and claimed to be the victim of mistaken identity. However, fingerprint analysis and other forensic evidence conclusively proved that she was the long-sought SLA fugitive, Kathleen Solaya. The revelation that their neighbor and friend had been a domestic terrorist fugitive for over 20 years stunned the Minnesota community where Olson had lived. Many residents struggled to reconcile the helpful community volunteer they knew with the violent revolutionary she had been. Olson was extradited to California to face charges related to her SLA activities, including conspiracy to commit murder and explosives violations. Her legal team argued that she had been rehabilitated during her years as a law-abiding citizen and mother. In 2001, Olson pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges related to the 1975 bombing plots and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, she later attempted to withdraw her guilty plea, claiming she had been coerced into accepting the agreement. Additional charges were filed against Olson for her participation in a 1975 bank robbery that resulted in the death of customer Myrna Opsahl. She eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in that case and received an additional sentence. Olson was released from prison in 2009 after serving her full sentence, returning to her family in Minnesota. Her case demonstrated how domestic terrorists could successfully hide in plain sight for decades while living seemingly normal lives. The Sarah Jane Olson case became a landmark example of successful, long-term fugitive concealment and raised questions about the statute of limitations for domestic terrorism crimes and the possibility of rehabilitation for former radicals. Case 4. Lynn Stewart. Lynn Stewart built her reputation as a fierce civil rights attorney who represented the most controversial and despised clients in America, from Black Panthers to Islamic radicals. Her commitment to zealous advocacy would ultimately cross the line from legal representation into active support for international terrorism, making her the first American lawyer convicted of aiding terrorist organizations. Born in 1939, Stewart grew up in Brooklyn and became radicalized during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. She earned her law degree from Rutgers University and dedicated her career to representing clients that other attorneys refused to take, including revolutionaries, gang members, and accused terrorists who needed aggressive legal defense. Stewart's client list read like a who's who of American radicals and international terrorists. She represented Weather Underground members, Black Liberation Army fighters, and Islamic extremists, who had been charged with plotting attacks against American targets. Her willingness to take these cases made her a hero to radical movements and a target for federal surveillance. In 1995, Stewart began representing Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, the blind Egyptian cleric who had been convicted of conspiracy in connection with the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and plots to attack other New York landmarks. Rahman was serving a life sentence in federal prison under special administrative measures that severely restricted his communications. The special administrative measures imposed on Rahman were designed to prevent him from communicating with his terrorist followers and continuing to direct violent activities from prison. These restrictions prohibited him from contacting anyone except his attorneys and immediate family members under strict supervision. Stewart initially followed the communication restrictions while representing Rahman in his appeals and legal matters. However, she gradually became convinced that the restrictions were unjust and began looking for ways to circumvent them while maintaining the appearance of compliance with court orders. Beginning in the late 1990s, Stewart began smuggling messages from Rahman to his followers in Egypt and other countries where his terrorist organization remained active. She used her attorney-client visits to receive instructions from Rahman and then transmitted them to his supporters through intermediaries. Her legal expertise became a weapon in the hands of international terrorists as she helped Rahman maintain control over his organization despite his imprisonment. The messages she smuggled included instructions for terrorist operations and guidance for his followers who were planning attacks against Egyptian government targets. The FBI began monitoring Stewart's activities through surveillance of her prison visits and wiretaps of her communications with Rahman's associates. Federal investigators discovered that she was systematically violating the communication restrictions and facilitating ongoing terrorist activities. In 2000, Stewart publicly read a statement from Rahman to Reuters news service that withdrew his support for a ceasefire between his terrorist organization and the Egyptian government. This statement effectively authorized renewed terrorist attacks and demonstrated Stewart's active role in facilitating terrorism. The investigation revealed that Stewart had been smuggling messages for years, using her position as Rahman's attorney to maintain his connection with terrorist networks around the world. Her actions went far beyond zealous advocacy and constituted active participation in terrorist conspiracy. In 2002, Stewart was indicted on charges of conspiracy to provide material support to terrorism, conspiracy to defraud the United States, and making false statements to federal authorities. The charges marked the first time an American attorney had been prosecuted for actively supporting terrorism through legal representation. During her 2005 trial, Stewart argued that she was providing zealous advocacy for her client and that attorney privilege protected her communications with Rahman. She claimed that the government was criminalizing legitimate legal representation and violating First Amendment rights. Prosecutors demonstrated that Stewart's actions went far beyond legal representation and constituted active participation in terrorist conspiracy. Evidence included recorded conversations where she discussed her role in facilitating Rahman's communications with his terrorist followers. Stewart was convicted on all charges and initially sentenced to 28 months in prison, a term that prosecutors appealed as too lenient. An appeals court agreed and ordered her resentenced to 10 years in federal prison for her role in supporting terrorism. During her imprisonment, Stewart developed breast cancer and became a cause célèbre among radical activists who viewed her as a political prisoner. Her supporters argued that she was being punished for representing unpopular clients rather than for actual criminal activity. In 2013, Stewart was granted compassionate release due to her terminal cancer diagnosis and died in 2017. Her case established important precedents about the limits of attorney-client privilege in terrorism cases, and the prosecution of lawyers who facilitate terrorist activities. The Lynn Stewart case demonstrated how professional obligations and radical ideologies could combine to create active support for terrorism, showing that even respected attorneys could become weapons in the hands of international terrorist organizations. Case 5. Afia Siddiqui. Dr. Afia Siddiqui was a Pakistani neuroscientist who earned degrees from MIT and Brandeis University, representing the pinnacle of academic achievement in America's most prestigious institutions. Her brilliant scientific mind, which should have been dedicated to advancing human knowledge, would allegedly be turned toward developing weapons of mass destruction for al-Qaeda terrorist operations. Born in Pakistan in 1972, Siddiqui moved to the United States in the 1990s to pursue advanced education in neuroscience. She completed her undergraduate studies at MIT with honors and earned a PhD from Brandeis University, establishing herself as a promising researcher with expertise in cognitive neuroscience and brain function. Following the September 11 attacks, federal investigators began examining the activities of foreign nationals who possessed scientific knowledge that could be used for terrorist purposes. Siddiqui's expertise in neuroscience and her connections to Islamic organizations made her a person of interest in counterterrorism investigations. In 2003, the FBI issued a global alert seeking information about Siddiqui's whereabouts, identifying her as a suspected al-Qaeda operative who had been involved in planning attacks against American targets. The alert described her as having knowledge of chemical and biological weapons that could be used in terrorist operations. Shortly after the FBI alert was issued, Siddiqui disappeared from her home in Massachusetts, along with her 3 young children. Her sudden disappearance triggered an international manhunt as authorities sought to determine whether she had fled to avoid prosecution or had been kidnapped by unknown parties. For 5 years, Siddiqui's whereabouts remained completely unknown, despite extensive investigations by American and international law enforcement agencies. Her disappearance became one of the most puzzling cases in counterterrorism efforts, with conflicting theories about whether she was hiding voluntarily or had become a victim herself. Her scientific brilliance would be turned into a weapon of mass destruction, as intelligence reports suggested she was using her neuroscience expertise to help al-Qaeda develop chemical and biological weapons. Her knowledge of brain chemistry and toxic substances made her invaluable for creating weapons that could kill thousands of people. In July 2008, Afghan police arrested Siddiqui outside a government compound in Ghazni, Afghanistan, where she was allegedly carrying documents describing potential terrorist targets, including the Statue of Liberty, Empire State Building, and Brooklyn Bridge. The documents also contained information about chemical and biological weapons. During her detention at an Afghan police station, Siddiqui allegedly grabbed an M4 rifle from an American soldier who was preparing to interrogate her and opened fire on U.S. military personnel and FBI agents. The shooting incident resulted in Siddiqui being wounded and charged with attempted murder. The circumstances surrounding her arrest and the shooting incident became highly controversial, with Siddiqui's defense team claiming she had been tortured during her 5-year disappearance and was suffering from severe mental illness that affected her actions during the confrontation. In 2010, Siddiqui was tried in federal court in New York on charges of attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, and firearms violations related to the shooting incident in Afghanistan. Her trial became a focal point for international attention and diplomatic tensions. During the trial, Siddiqui's erratic behavior and outbursts in court supported defense arguments that she was mentally ill and not competent to stand trial. However, psychiatric evaluations determined she was capable of understanding the proceedings and assisting in her defense. Despite defense arguments about mental illness and alleged torture, Siddiqui was convicted on all charges related to the shooting incident. The jury rejected claims that she was too mentally ill to be held responsible for her attempt to murder American military and law enforcement personnel. Siddiqui was sentenced to 86 years in federal prison, making her sentence the longest ever imposed on a woman in an American terrorism case. The sentence reflected the seriousness of her attempt to kill American personnel and her alleged role in al-Qaeda weapons development. She is currently serving her sentence at Federal Medical Center Carswell in Texas, where she receives treatment for mental health issues while remaining in high-security custody. Her case continues to generate diplomatic tensions between the United States and Pakistan. The Afia Siddiqui case remains one of the most controversial terrorism prosecutions in American history, raising questions about the use of scientific knowledge for terrorist purposes and the treatment of suspected terrorists during the global war on terror. Case 6. Donna Joan Borup. Donna Joan Borup emerged from the radical underground of the 1980s as a member of the May 19th Communist Organization, a violent offshoot of the Weather Underground that continued the tradition of domestic terrorism long after the original group had disbanded. Her commitment to revolutionary violence would lead to one of the most vicious attacks on law enforcement in the history of domestic terrorism. The May 19th Communist Organization, formed in the early 1980s as former Weather Underground members and other radical activists sought to continue armed struggle against the American government, the group took its name from the shared birthday of Malcolm X and Ho Chi Minh, reflecting their commitment to international revolutionary solidarity and violent resistance. Borup became deeply involved in the organization's activities, which included supporting imprisoned radicals, planning armed robberies to fund revolutionary activities, and carrying out attacks against symbols of government authority. Her dedication to the cause made her a trusted member of the group's inner circle. The organization's ideology combined elements of Marxism, Black nationalism, and anti-imperialism into a revolutionary framework that justified violence against government officials and law enforcement officers. Members viewed themselves as freedom fighters engaged in legitimate warfare against an oppressive capitalist system. During a protest demonstration, Borup committed one of the most shocking acts of violence against law enforcement in the history of domestic terrorism. She approached a Port Authority police officer who was maintaining order during the demonstration and threw acid directly into his face, causing severe chemical burns and permanent disfigurement. The acid attack represented a new level of personal violence in domestic terrorism, moving beyond bombings and shootings to intimate, face-to-face assaults designed to cause maximum pain and permanent injury. The attack demonstrated the depths of hatred that radical ideology could generate toward law enforcement personnel. The officer who was attacked suffered severe chemical burns that required extensive medical treatment and plastic surgery. His injuries were so severe that he was permanently disabled and unable to continue his law enforcement career, making him a victim of revolutionary violence for the rest of his life. Following the acid attack, Borup disappeared into the underground network of safe houses and false identities that had protected radical fugitives since the 1970s. Her ability to vanish completely demonstrated the continued effectiveness of revolutionary support networks, despite decades of FBI infiltration efforts. She would vanish into the underground, becoming one of America's most wanted fugitives, and remaining at large for decades despite intensive law enforcement efforts to locate and arrest her. Her disappearance marked the beginning of one of the longest manhunts in FBI history. The FBI investigation into Borup's whereabouts involved tracking radical networks across the country, monitoring known associates, and following leads from informants within revolutionary organizations. Despite these efforts, she successfully avoided detection while living under assumed identities. Borup's case became a symbol of the ongoing threat posed by 1980s radical organizations that continued operating long after public attention had moved away from domestic terrorism. Her fugitive status demonstrated that revolutionary networks remained active and capable of protecting their members from prosecution. The acid attack and Borup's successful escape highlighted the personal nature of revolutionary violence and the willingness of domestic terrorists to target individual law enforcement officers for brutal assault. Her crime represented terrorism on the most intimate and vicious level possible. Over the decades, the FBI has continued investigating leads and following tips about Borup's possible whereabouts, but she has successfully maintained her fugitive status despite being one of the most wanted domestic terrorists in American history. Her case remains active on the FBI's most wanted list. The May 19th communist organization eventually disbanded as members were arrested or went underground, but Borup's continued fugitive status serves as a reminder that some domestic terrorists from the 1980s radical movement remain unaccounted for and potentially dangerous. Her case demonstrates the long-term consequences of domestic terrorism and the ability of dedicated revolutionaries to avoid capture through careful planning and underground support networks. The acid attack remains one of the most personally vicious crimes in the history of American domestic terrorism. Today, Donna Joan Borup remains one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives, representing an unresolved case from the era of 1980s domestic terrorism. Her successful, decades-long evasion of capture makes her one of the most elusive domestic terrorists in American history. The ongoing search for Borup continues to consume FBI resources and serves as a reminder that domestic terrorism cases can remain active for decades. Her fugitive status represents the ultimate failure of the justice system to hold domestic terrorists accountable for their violent crimes. Case 7. Marilyn Jean Buck. Marilyn Jean Buck was a white radical who dedicated her entire adult life to supporting black militant causes, becoming one of the most committed and dangerous domestic terrorists of the 1970s and 1980s. Her willingness to sacrifice everything for revolutionary ideology would lead to an 80-year prison sentence and a lifetime of incarceration for facilitating some of the most audacious terrorist operations in American history. Born in 1947 to a middle-class Texas family, Buck became radicalized during her college years at the University of Texas, where she was exposed to civil rights activism and anti-war protests. Her transformation from conventional student to revolutionary militant reflected the broader radicalization of white activists who embraced black nationalist ideology. Buck's commitment to black liberation movements led her to join the Weather Underground and later collaborate directly with the Black Liberation Army in planning and executing violent operations against government targets. Her white appearance made her valuable for operations that required avoiding suspicion from law enforcement agencies. During the 1970s, Buck became involved in some of the most notorious prison breaks in American history, using her skills and resources to help imprisoned black militants escape from maximum security facilities. Her most famous operation involved facilitating the 1979 prison break of Assata Shakur from Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey. The Shakur prison break required months of planning and coordination between Weather Underground members and Black Liberation Army operatives. Buck played a crucial role in providing weapons, vehicles, and safe houses that made the escape possible, demonstrating her commitment to revolutionary violence. Following Shakur's successful escape, Buck continued her involvement in armed robberies and terrorist operations designed to fund revolutionary activities and support imprisoned militants. Her participation in these crimes escalated from logistical support to direct involvement in violent confrontations with law enforcement. On October 20, 1981, Buck participated in the planning and support operations for the deadly Brinks armored car robbery in Nyack, New York, that killed 3 people, including 2 police officers. Her role involved providing weapons and coordination for the Black Liberation Army gunmen who carried out the attack. The Brinks robbery represented the culmination of Buck's revolutionary activities, combining her expertise in weapons procurement with her commitment to funding black militant operations through armed robbery. The operation's deadly outcome demonstrated the lethal consequences of her radical ideology. Her commitment to revolution would cost her nearly her entire adult life, when federal investigators tracked her involvement in multiple terrorist operations spanning more than a decade. The evidence against her included weapons purchases, safe house rentals, and communications with known terrorists. In 1985, Buck was arrested and charged with conspiracy, racketeering, and weapons violations related to her extensive involvement in Weather Underground and Black Liberation Army operations. The charges carried potential sentences that could keep her imprisoned for the rest of her life. During her trial, Buck refused to recognize the legitimacy of the American legal system and used her court appearances to deliver revolutionary speeches denouncing capitalism and white supremacy. Her defiant attitude demonstrated her continued commitment to radical ideology despite facing life imprisonment. Buck was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 80 years in federal prison, one of the longest sentences ever imposed on a domestic terrorist. The sentence reflected the scope of her criminal activities and her leadership role in facilitating violent operations over many years. During her 25 years in federal prison, Buck continued her radical activism through writing poetry and essays that promoted revolutionary ideology. She became a respected figure among imprisoned radicals and maintained her commitment to Black liberation movements despite her incarceration. Buck's prison writings gained attention from academic and literary circles, leading to the publication of her poetry and essays about revolutionary struggle and the prison experience. Her intellectual output during imprisonment demonstrated her continued influence on radical movements. In 2010, Buck was granted compassionate release after being diagnosed with terminal cancer. Her release came after serving 25 years of her 80-year sentence, making her one of the longest-serving domestic terrorists in American history. Buck died of cancer just weeks after her release from prison, ending a life dedicated to revolutionary violence and Black liberation ideology. Her death marked the end of an era in American domestic terrorism and the passing of one of its most committed practitioners. The legacy of Marilyn Jean Buck's revolutionary activities continues to influence discussions about white involvement in Black militant movements and the intersection of racial justice and violent resistance. Her life sentence, reduced by compassionate release, demonstrated both the consequences of domestic terrorism and the possibility of mercy for dying prisoners. Case 8. Harriet Tubman Adams. Harriet "Harry" Tubman Adams emerged from the American Indian movement during the 1970s as indigenous rights activism escalated into armed confrontation with federal authorities. Her involvement in AIM's most violent operations would place her at the center of deadly conflicts that challenged the federal government's authority over Native American territories and sparked debates about the line between resistance and terrorism. The American Indian movement formed in 1968 to address the systematic oppression and poverty facing Native American communities across the United States. What began as peaceful advocacy for treaty rights and cultural preservation gradually evolved into militant confrontation as activists became frustrated with government inaction and continued violations of tribal sovereignty. Adams became involved in AIM during the height of the organization's militant activities, when leaders had concluded that peaceful protest was insufficient to address centuries of government betrayal and cultural genocide. Her commitment to indigenous rights made her a trusted member of AIM's inner circle during its most confrontational period. The movement's ideology combined traditional Native American spiritual beliefs with modern revolutionary tactics, creating a unique form of militant activism that drew inspiration from both ancestral resistance and contemporary liberation movements. AIM members viewed themselves as warriors defending their people against ongoing colonization. In 1973, Adams participated in the armed occupation of Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, a 71-day standoff that became the defining moment of indigenous militant activism. The occupation was designed to protest government corruption and demand recognition of treaty rights that had been violated for over a century. The Wounded Knee occupation quickly escalated into armed confrontation as federal agents surrounded the area and AIM militants prepared for siege warfare. Adams was among the AIM members who stockpiled weapons and ammunition in preparation for what they believed would be a fight to the death against federal forces. During the occupation, sporadic gunfire exchanges occurred between AIM militants and federal agents, resulting in casualties on both sides. The violence demonstrated AIM's willingness to engage in armed resistance against federal authority and their commitment to defending occupied territory through force. The fight for indigenous rights would turn deadly on American soil as the standoff continued for over 2 months, with Adams and other AIM militants maintaining their positions despite federal pressure and the constant threat of assault. The occupation became a symbol of indigenous resistance that inspired Native American activists worldwide. Federal agents eventually ended the occupation through negotiated surrender rather than direct assault, but the violence during the standoff had already claimed lives and established AIM as a militant organization willing to use deadly force against government authorities. Following Wounded Knee, Adams remained involved in AIM activities that continued to challenge federal authority over Native American affairs. Her participation in subsequent confrontations demonstrated her ongoing commitment to militant resistance, despite the legal risks involved. The FBI launched extensive investigations into AIM activities, using informants and surveillance to track the organization's members and prevent future violent confrontations. Adams became a target of these investigations due to her prominent role in Wounded Knee and other militant operations. Legal proceedings against AIM members produced mixed results, with some trials ending in convictions, while others collapsed due to government misconduct and violations of defendants' rights. The inconsistent outcomes reflected the complex legal and political issues surrounding indigenous resistance movements. Adams faced various charges related to her AIM activities, but the legal complications surrounding indigenous rights and federal jurisdiction created uncertainty about the appropriate classification of her actions. Some prosecutors viewed AIM activities as domestic terrorism, while others saw them as legitimate resistance to government oppression. The terrorism designation for AIM activities remained disputed throughout the legal proceedings, with defense attorneys arguing that indigenous people had the right to resist ongoing colonization and government treaty violations. This argument complicated efforts to prosecute AIM members under terrorism statutes. Some trials against AIM members collapsed when evidence emerged of extensive FBI misconduct, including illegal surveillance, evidence tampering, and the use of unreliable informants. These revelations undermined prosecutions and raised questions about the government's tactics against indigenous activists. Adams's case became part of the broader controversy surrounding the government's response to AIM and the appropriate limits of indigenous resistance. Her involvement in violent confrontations highlighted the tensions between federal authority and tribal sovereignty that continue to influence Native American politics. The legacy of Adams's AIM activities continues to influence discussions about indigenous rights, government accountability, and the classification of resistance movements as terrorism. Her case demonstrates the complex legal and political issues that arise when oppressed communities resort to armed resistance against government authority. 8 American women who transformed from citizens into domestic militants reveal disturbing patterns about radicalization, ideology, and the evolution of homegrown terrorism across 5 decades of American history. Their cases spanned from the 1960s revolutionary violence to modern international terrorism support, demonstrating how female involvement in militant activities has adapted to changing political movements and global conflicts. The ideological diversity among these militants is striking. Whether underground Marxism, Black liberation support, indigenous rights activism, and Islamic extremism represent completely different motivations, yet all produced women willing to kill or facilitate violence for their causes. Bernardine Dern and Kathy Boudin emerged from 1970s leftist movements, while Lynn Stewart and Afia Siddiqui represent post-9/11 Islamic radicalization patterns. Each woman exploited fundamental assumptions about female behavior and violence to avoid detection and carry out operations. Sarah Jane Olson used her suburban mother identity to hide for decades. Marilyn Jean Buck, leveraged her white appearance to support black militant operations. Lynn Stewart exploited attorney privilege to facilitate terrorism communications. The methods employed evolved dramatically over time, reflecting technological advances and changing security environments. Early cases like Dorn involved traditional bombing campaigns, while later cases like Stewart demonstrated how professional positions could be weaponized for terrorist support. Donna Joan Borup's acid attack represented intimate, personal violence against individual officers. American citizenship became their most powerful weapon, providing freedom of movement, access to targets, and constitutional protections that foreign terrorists could never exploit. Their betrayal of citizenship represents a fundamental violation of the social contract that grants rights in exchange for loyalty to democratic institutions. Legal responses varied dramatically based on era and political climate. Dorn received only probation, despite bombing federal buildings, while Siddiqui received 86 years for attempted murder. Buck's 80-year sentence was reduced by compassionate release, demonstrating inconsistent approaches to domestic terrorism punishment. The international complications created by these cases show how domestic militancy becomes diplomatic problems. Stewart's case strained relations with Islamic countries, while Siddiqui's prosecution created tensions with Pakistan. These women transformed from American citizens into sources of international controversy. Current status reveals long-term consequences. Dorn avoided accountability and became an academic. Boudin was paroled and became an advocate. Olson completed her sentence and returned to family life. Stewart died after compassionate release. Siddiqui serves 86 years. Borup remains a fugitive. Buck died after compassionate release, and Adams faced mixed legal outcomes. Their cases provide crucial lessons about female radicalization across different ideological movements and time periods. The assumption that women are less likely to engage in terrorism has been repeatedly proven false by these 8 cases spanning multiple decades and diverse causes. The evolution from 1970s bombing campaigns to modern terrorism facilitation demonstrates how female militants adapted to changing technological and political environments, while maintaining their capacity for violence and betrayal of American democratic values and institutions. 8 women who proved that domestic militancy knows no gender, no background, and no limits when radical ideology meets opportunity and American citizenship. Bernadine Dorn bombed the U.S. Capitol and Pentagon, yet avoided prison through legal technicalities. Kathy Boudin participated in armed robbery that murdered 3 people before earning parole and academic respectability. Sarah Jane Olson lived as a suburban soccer mom for decades while hiding her terrorist past from neighbors and friends. Lynn Stewart used her law degree to smuggle messages for imprisoned terrorists, facilitating continued attacks from behind bars. Afia Siddiqui allegedly planned chemical and biological attacks before receiving the longest terrorism sentence ever imposed on a woman. Donna Joan Borup threw acid in a police officer's face and remains a fugitive on the FBI's most wanted list today. Marilyn Jean Buck facilitated prison breaks and armed robberies, serving 25 years of an 80-year sentence before dying of cancer. Harriet Adams participated in the violent Wounded Knee occupation that brought warfare to American soil through indigenous militant resistance. Their collective impact extends far beyond individual crimes and sentences. These women shattered assumptions about female violence and domestic security, forcing law enforcement to recognize that students, lawyers, mothers, and professionals could become America's most dangerous internal enemies. From weather underground bombings in the 1970s to terrorism support in the 2000s, these militants adapted their methods to changing political movements while maintaining their commitment to violence against their own country. Their American citizenship became their most powerful weapon, providing access and constitutional protections that foreign enemies could never achieve. The ongoing consequences continue shaping American counterterrorism efforts and legal precedents. Dorn's lenient treatment contrasts sharply with Siddiqui's 86-year sentence, demonstrating how political climate affects domestic terrorism prosecutions. Borup's decades-long fugitive status proves that some cases remain forever unresolved. Which case shocked you most? The Capitol bomber who became a law professor? The Brinks robber who earned parole and respectability? The suburban mother hiding a terrorist past? The lawyer who smuggled messages for imprisoned terrorists? The neuroscientist planning mass casualty attacks? The acid attacker still on the run? The prison break facilitator who died behind bars? Or the indigenous militant who brought warfare to reservation lands? These women didn't just commit terrorism, they exploited every advantage American society provided them. Their education, professional positions, family status, and constitutional rights became weapons against the very system that had protected and empowered them throughout their lives. The debate continues over appropriate responses to domestic militancy committed by American citizens. Should citizenship provide protection against ultimate consequences? Do these cases justify enhanced surveillance of radical movements? How can society balance civil liberties with security needs when the threats come from within? Their stories serve as warnings about radicalization potential within American communities and the need for vigilance against those who exploit freedoms to wage war against democratic values. Each woman chose violence over peaceful advocacy, militancy over legal protest, and betrayal over loyalty to constitutional principles. Subscribe to Savage Case Files for more investigations into domestic terrorism, international crimes, and the pursuit of justice across different legal systems. Hit the notification bell to never miss our examinations of how individual criminals challenge fundamental assumptions about security, trust, and citizenship. From whether underground leadership to international terrorism support, these 8 women transformed their American identities into weapons against their own country. Their prison sentences, fugitive status, and controversial releases reflect the ultimate consequences of choosing militancy over citizenship. This has been Savage Case Files, where American betrayal meets revolutionary violence, and where the truth about domestic militancy is exposed. 8 women who proved that the greatest threats often come from those who walk among us, hiding deadly intentions behind familiar faces and constitutional protections.